1959 in Reuter, and this is my first opportunity to come back to Salzburg. What I'd like to talk about this morning is what I think of as a very significant transition which is occurring in the field of geoinformation and is, I think, going to have a very significant impact on the future. I will be speaking, of course, from a US perspective, and I'd be very interested in discussing afterwards the various ways in which this perspective is different in Germany and Austria. But it is, I think, a very important transition which is occurring now, and I'd like to talk about it and some of its implications. Perhaps an appropriate place to start is here, which is to ask how geographic information is created, how it has been created in the past, our traditional mechanisms for creating geographic data. And essentially, that has been dominated in the past by authorities and by their experts. So in the United States, the US Geological Survey is our primary civilian mapping agency. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency is the military equivalent. In the UK, of course, there's the Ordnance Survey. In many countries, mapping is a military operation. I believe that Colombia is still the only country in South America whose mapping is civilian rather than military. And increasingly, state and local governments are involved. This is then the traditional world, and it's a world in which experts create geographic information and disseminate it essentially to non-expert users under various kinds of restrictions, licensing restrictions, for example. It's a big difference around the world depending on whether geoinformation is distributed at the cost of production or at the cost of reproduction. And certainly in the United States, we've seen a lot of restrictions since the events of 9/11 because of the believed relationship between geoinformation and national security. However, and let me just take a single example here to illustrate the basic point I want to make. And let me use this example of the naming process, the process by which features on the Earth's surface get named. And in the United States, and certainly this is true in many other countries, naming is a function of a national agency called the US Board on Geographic Names, which dates from 1890. And beneath it, there's a hierarchy of boards from local to national levels. All of them composed of experts, all of them concerned with standardizing naming, with removing duplicates, and particularly with removing names which are politically incorrect or rude in some sense. Certainly the landscape has been littered in the past with very colorful names which have been largely removed. An excellent book by Mark Monmonier traces the history of this process. At the same time, within this process, there's been no role for amateurs and no role for the general public. Even though the general public is ultimately the source of naming, this process synthesizes and standardizes, primarily to avoid confusion, to avoid ambiguity in postal delivery, and so on. Now, compare that to 1507. 501 years ago, when a map was made by Martin Waldseemüller in Saint-Dié-de-Vosges in France, and it was a map of the world, and on it, Waldseemüller showed the large area of landmass which had recently been discovered to the west of the Atlantic, and believing that it was a new continent, devised a name for it. And he decided the appropriate name would be America because he was in contact with Florence and with Amerigo Vespucci, who was claiming to have been the first person to have identified America as a new continent. And Waldseemüller believed that all continents should have female names, so he took the first name of Vespucci, feminized it, and came up with the name America. And he put that name on the map. And that was the event, essentially, which named America. And that name stuck because the map was widely distributed. Later, Waldseemüller regretted his decision. He became convinced that, in fact, Vespucci's claims were not authenticated, and as a result, in later maps, removed the name. But it was too late, and we are I currently reside in the United States of America, and it's only by chance that I don't reside in the United States of Colombia or some other name. Walsingham had no qualification whatever to do this, no authority whatever. There was no board on geographic names. There was no one to say this was acceptable. He simply did it. That was 501 years ago. And what I want to suggest is that essentially this process is coming back. It's coming back in the sense of what I'm terming volunteer geographic information. Think of Martin Walsingham as volunteering the name of America. And think of how today that process, in fact, is regenerating. And it's regenerating in a very different way. So what is volunteer geographic information? Volunteer geographic information is essentially a phenomenon of the 21st century. In fact, a phenomenon really of recent months. It's very difficult to trace this back more than a couple of years. It's related to a number of other terms, and these are not specific to geographic information, and they have slightly different meaning, but let me just briefly review them. The term user-generated content, which is about the nature of the web today and the amount of information on the web which is generated essentially by its users. Think of blogs, think of wikis, think of Wikipedia, etc. Collective intelligence, the argument that if enough people contribute to the same information, it will converge on the truth. Very different approach to quality control from the approach that's been normal in geoinformation. Just the notion that is implemented, for example, by Wikipedia, which argues that its content is converging on the truth because everyone can edit it. Crowdsourcing is a term which has a very similar meaning. All of this is information which is asserted rather than authoritative. There is no authority here. Information is simply being asserted by individuals, typically by users. So what you have here is really a phenomenon which represents the empowerment of potentially millions of private citizens. And the numbers of people doing this currently certainly amount to thousands, if not tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands. These people are largely untrained. They are average citizens. There's no reward. There's no obvious benefit to doing this. There's no guarantee that what they do is the truth, and they have no authority to do so. But within that framework, let's look at what is happening, because I think what is happening is really very significant. So let me give you just a few examples. There are literally hundreds of them out there. I've chosen these examples because they help me make certain points. This is Wikimapia. Wikimapia's mantra is to describe the whole world. And it invites anyone, you, me, anyone, to describe any feature on the Earth's surface in as much detail as we feel appropriate. We identify the location by outlining a rectangle on this map here, which is the coverage of the University of California, Santa Barbara campus, has many such rectangles. And if I were live, I could move the cursor around, and if I were to click on any of these rectangles, I would get access to a description of that feature, including its name. Its location, of course, is there because of the rectangle, and there may be links to other information as well. Many of these are very straightforward. Each of these, someone has entered every building on the campus and a brief description. Somebody was motivated to do that. Over here is Isla Vista, which is the area where most of our students live. And if you were to click on it, and I wish I could do it here,